everyone, I'm Celine from Blue Calla Patterns and welcome to video 3 for the Begonia backpack. When I ended the last video, I lied and I said we would start with the drawstring connectors, but we're actually going to attach the bottom pieces of our bags together. The exterior back piece and the front piece. We're going to sew the bottom pieces together along this bottom edge. So we're actually going to put them right sides together. And I'll clip them together. And then I'm going to sew just only along this bottom edge with our typical 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then we're going to press that seam open and we'll top stitch on both sides of the seam. Okay, so I've sewn the bottom edge here. If you're using fabric, you can just press that seam allowance open, but I'm using cork, so what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to have to finger press and top stitch as I'm pressing down with my fingers. So I have to go over to my machine and I'll just press down like this, and I'll start by back stitching, top stitching 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from this center seam all along this side. And then I'll stop and I'll rotate and I'll go over to the other side and I'll do the same thing. I'll finger press and I'll top stitch with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance from that center seam, and then I'll back stitch at the end. Okay, so this is finger press down and top stitch. So I'm going to lift it up so you can see. You can see this a little bit better this way, and flip it over from this side so you can see what it looks like from this side. Okay, so now this part is ready. We're now going to do our drawstring connectors. Okay, now there's two different ways to sew these depending on whether you've chosen to use cork or vinyl like I have, or if you're using fabric. So you have to sew them a little bit differently, and also you'll notice in the cutting chart that you have to cut them a different size depending on what type of material you're using. So since I'm using cork, I'm going to do that method. And then I'll just briefly explain how you should do it afterwards if you're using fabric. So start by drawing a line on the wrong side along the entire length. Okay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my machine. I can't press cork, obviously. So again, I have to fold and sew as I go. So I'm going to fold in this half towards that center line. And I'm going to sew along the outer edge with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then when I get to the end, I'll rotate and start sewing across. Bring this over. And then I'm going to sew along the bottom, rotate again, and sew as I'm folding. So with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then make sure you're back stitching at the beginning and the end, and you'll do that for both pieces. If you're using fabric, it's going to be slightly wider, and you're going to fold them this way, wrong sides together, and you're going to sew along the longer edge with 1/4 inch seam allowance, and make sure you back stitch at the beginning and the end. Then you're going to have a little fabric tube. You're going to turn that fabric tube right side out, press it nice and flat, and then top stitch along both edges with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sew these up, and then we'll attach them to our bag. Okay, so whether you used fabric or cork or vinyl like me, you should have two little strap pieces now. You're going to fold them in half so the raw edges are together. And then you're just going to base stitch those raw edges together with 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. It's just so that they stay together. Okay, so go base stitch the raw ends together. Okay, so now these have formed like these little loops, and you're going to take your the exterior of your bag, and you're going to place each one along the edge. Now, one important thing, if you haven't interfaced your drawstring cord, then I would suggest it's okay to have it sticking out the ends here about 1/2 inch. If you interfaced it, you're going to need a little bit more space in here. So what I would suggest then is to only have it sticking out about 1/4 inch here. I'm going to interface my strap, so I'm only going to stick it out 1/4 inch here. And you want the top edge here to be about 1/4 inch from the top edge of your bottom piece. So just slightly beneath the line of top stitching. And then you're going to just base stitch these in place for now. Okay? So just base stitch with 1/8 inch seam allowance here and here. Okay, so these are basted in place now. And we're just going to sew up the sides of our bag. So flip the exterior panel half, and you want them right sides together. Now, what I would start by doing is lining up the top edges of the bottom pieces so that they're aligned. It looks nicer when these pieces are aligned. If this is a little bit off, it's not as important, but it definitely looks nicer if the top edges of the bottom pieces are perfectly aligned. So I usually start by doing that on both sides. Okay, and then I'll pin the rest. Line up the top corners, pin those, and then everything in between. Now, it's possible that the front panel with the zippers is a little bit crooked on the edges from doing the assembly. So I would actually recommend following the edge of the exterior back panel and using that as your guide for the seam allowance that you need to sew with. I forgot to mention that when you're in the basting step that you should trim excess zipper. I don't have very much, so I'm actually not going to trim it. And these are already sealed. I seal the ends with the lighter, so I don't want to cut them. If you do end up cutting yours, just make sure that you seal the ends so that your zipper doesn't fray. Okay, so now I'm going to go over to the machine and I'm going to sew this side and this side, making sure that I backstitch at the beginning and the end. Okay, so I've sewn my side seams, and one thing I would recommend that I like to do is at the area of the connectors, I like to sew twice just to make sure that the connectors are really secure in the seam. Now we're going to box our corners. So to box the corners, you're going to line up that side seam with the center bottom seam of the bottom pieces. And you're going to clip those together. And then you just sew from one edge, you backstitch, sew across, and then when you get to the other end, you backstitch. I also sew my box corners twice. So I do 2 lines of stitching, a little bit less than 1/8 inch apart. Okay, both of the boxed corners are sewn up. I'm just going to trim the seam allowance, and then I'm going to turn my bag. Okay. Okay, so this part of the bag is done. I'm going to trim a thread. Okay, so I'm going to set this aside and I'm going to get my drawstring casing pieces and we'll sew those together now. Okay, so now we're going to sew up our drawstring casings. You should have 4 pieces in total. If you decided to add interfacing to 2 of the pieces, make sure that you do have a set where one piece is not interfaced and the other one is. I have no interfacing on any of these pieces. So you're going to match up the two sets together. So they have to be right sides together. And you're going to pin, this has glue on it. You have to pin these shorter ends together for both sets. Like so. Okay, I'm going to show you just with one set and then you can repeat it for the second set. So once you have the short ends pinned together, you're going to sew them together along these shorter sides and make sure to backstitch. Okay, so once they're sewn together, take your pins out and now you're going to flip them so they are wrong sides together. And then roll those seams and press them. Along both sides. And then you're just going to go over to your machine and you're going to top stitch the seam allowance here and here. Okay, so top stitch on both of the shorter ends. Now this is important. If you decided to interface one of the pieces, when you're folding this down, you want the interfaced piece to be on the outside, not the inside. And I'm just going to actually press this because it'll avoid me having to use pins or clips. Okay, so you're just going to fold it in half this way. And then we need to mark the center. So fold it in half this way. And you can make a mark with a fabric pen, or what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a pin and use the pin to mark the center. Okay. And then we're going to pin this to the top edge. And now I realize I forgot to put my center marks on the tops here. So I'm going to mark my centers now. Fold this in half. And I'm going to make a mark for the center here. And also here. Okay. So then you take your casing piece and just on the front piece you're going to line up those center marks. And here I'm going to switch to clips. Pull this out. And you're going to clip this to the top edge on one side, and you want to make sure that all the raw edges are together. So the raw edges of the casing and the raw edges of the exterior shell of your bag are all lined up at the top. And then all you're going to do for now is you're going to base the casing to this side of your bag along the top edge. And then you're going to repeat all those steps, and you're going to do the same with the second drawstring casing on the back side of the bag. Okay, so the exterior of our bag is 100% complete. We have our little pockets, and we should now have the casings on both sides, the front and the back. In the very last video, we're going to assemble the lining, which will be very, very fast. And we will also put the lining and the exterior together, and then we're going to sew up our strap and thread it through the casings.